my favorite games of all time is chess. I feel that chess is an incredible strategy game, or it is an incredible strategy game, and it's a great way to use your mind to think through different possibilities, through different go through a decision making process that's complex and involves strategy, and it's just a really nice game to relax with, and there's different forms of it online. There's speed chess, there's competitive chess if you get really good with it with chess. But I grew up playing chess, or actually initially just watching my dad and my brother play chess. My older brother Dave play chess, and I was fascinated, and I kind of made fun of it. And then later on in life, I found out that it was something that I got pretty good with it. And I was never phenomenal or anything, but I got fairly good with it. And I started reading books on chess strategies, and I find it's a really great form of just a type of a game that is very um, involves actually using your mind, using your brain, and kind of doing like almost like creative problem solving. It's not just like a video game and you're shooting aliens or something like that. It's a game where you're using your brain to solve problems. The problem is you are being, so to speak, attacked by your opponent, but you're learning different ways, different strategies in order to defeat your opponent, to trap your opponent ultimately, so they can no longer move. They trap their king. So it's really there's a lot involved. It's very cerebral in orientation if you like that kind of thing, but it's also very relaxing, and it's a nice way to take your mind off of things. Very stressful day at work, and go online. I used to go on to Internet Chess Club, but this is a nice little video that basically just teaches you the basics of chess. If you ever want to learn how to play chess, it's a great game. And there's other similar games. I guess you can say checkers is a kind of more basic kind of strategy game, strategy type of chess game. Then you have Go, which is maybe not necessarily more complex than chess, but definitely on the same level as chess, from my opinion. But so yeah, I hope you enjoy this. This is just a video I saw online. Looks pretty straightforward about the fundamentals of playing playing chess and how pieces move, and definitely for beginners. But I hope you enjoy it.
Video, I'm going to teach you how to play chess. So chess is a two-player game played on a board of dark and light colored squares. You've got white pieces and black pieces. And white always goes first, and then players just take turns making moves one at a time. The objective of the game is to checkmate your opponent's king. So these are the kings. They usually have some sort of little cross on the top of them. Sometimes they look a little different, but that's how you can tell which one's the king and which one's the queen. Just look for the little cross. Checkmate, it just means that you've trapped the other person's king. And we'll talk about that more once we learn how all the pieces move. So there are 6 different types of pieces. There's rooks, knights, bishops, queens, kings, and pawns on a chessboard. And they all have different ways that they move. So what I'm going to do now is just go one at a time and talk about how each of them move. The rook moves in straight lines. It can be up or down, left or right. It can go as far as it wants to, as long as it's not blocked by another piece. So if this black knight was right here, I could no longer go to these 2 squares with my rook because I'm blocked by the knight. And rooks capture pieces just by landing on top of the square that they're trying to capture. So if you're going to move somewhere, you just land on top and take the piece. Bishops move diagonally. So these are diagonals. It's basically just squares that are connected on their corners. And again, it can go as far as it wants to, just like the rook, as long as it's not blocked by another piece. So like here, I couldn't go to those 3 squares anymore. And capturing, you just land on top of the piece you're trying to capture. Queens are the most powerful piece on a chessboard, and you only have one of these. You have 2 rooks, 2 bishops, and only 1 queen. But the queen moves just like a rook and a bishop combined. So it can move in straight lines, up and down, left and right. It can all move diagonally like bishops. So as you can see, it covers a lot of squares. But also it can't, go through pieces. So now I can't go to these 3 squares, and if I want to capture something, I just move on top of it. The king, which is the piece that you're trying to checkmate. You're trying to checkmate your opponent's king and obviously not get your king checkmated. The king just moves in one square in any direction. So up, down, diagonally, left, right, sideways, just 1 square. That's it. Pretty straightforward. Knight is a cool piece. It's one of the trickier ones to understand, but it's not too bad. It moves in an L shape like that, and the L shape could be any rotation. So it could be over here to this way. It could be down here. These are the squares that the knight can go to. And if an L shape doesn't really make sense, another way to think about it is it moves 2 spaces in one direction, followed by 1 to the side. And so 2 in one direction, and then 1 to the side of that, either up or down, like that. 2 down, and then 1 over, and you can see how it still makes the L shape. The other cool thing about the knight is that it is allowed to jump over other pieces. So even if this knight was completely surrounded by like a bunch of pawns, I could still jump to these squares. It doesn't matter that there are pieces in my way. I can always go to the squares that are in an L shape from me. So that's a cool thing about knights. And last but not least, well, they are least, they're kind of the worst piece, but they're a little bit tricky to understand, are the pawns. So pawns move 1 space forward. So just like that. You just go 1 space forward. The tricky part is that they don't capture pieces the same way that they move. So all the other pieces that we looked at, if they move to a square and there's another piece on it, you just capture. So just real quick, as an example, if I move my rook up to where this bishop is, I just capture it because I landed on top of it. Well, pawns cannot capture the way that they move. What that means is if there's a piece in front of a pawn, it can't move like that. Pawns capture diagonally up. So if there's a piece over here, like another bishop's over here, I could capture it like that, diagonally. But if it's just like this, I'm stuck. This pawn can't move because it's blocked by the piece. So pawns move one way, they move 1 space forward, and they capture a different way. The other thing about pawns is that on the very first move of the game, so if they're on this starting rank, so where they first start at the beginning of the game, they're allowed to move 2 spaces. It's just like a special thing that they could do only on their first move, if you want. So instead of just 1, you can go 2 spaces. And the other thing about pawns, they are not allowed to move backwards. So once they go forward, can't move them backwards. All the other pieces can go forwards, backwards, it doesn't matter. Pawns have to go forward only. So just to recap, they move 1 space forward, but they capture diagonally forward. Alright, so now that you know how all the pieces move, the next thing you need to understand is what check and checkmate are. So in chess, check just means that a king is under attack. And checkmate means a king is under attack and it can't move, or you can't do anything to get out of check. So in this position, if white moves their rook up here, that's a check on black's king. Because as you can see, since rooks move in straight lines, it's attacking the square that the king's on. So on black's turn, he would have to move his king out of the way. So like right up there. So it's no longer check because he's out of the line of the rook. However, white's next move can be to move the rook up here, and this would be an example of checkmate. And the reason why is the rook is attacking the king, and if the king tries to move, let's say up here, it would still be in line with this rook, putting it in check. So you can't do that. And if you check all the spots that the black king can move to, they're all covered by these rooks. So it's checkmate. There's nothing that black can do to get out of this position. Now, if I were to like add a piece, let's say this bishop is sitting over here in this position, it's not checkmate anymore because black can move their bishop back here and block the rook. So that's just an example of check and checkmate. All right, so now you know how all the pieces move and you know what check and checkmate are. The last thing about chess is that there are 3 special moves in the game that are just kind of in their own category. They're just kind of weird. They don't follow the other rules. And so we're going to talk about those now. The first one is called pawn promotion. So if this is the position in the game and you're white and you move this pawn up, let's say black moves his king here, move your pawn up, black moves his king here, and your pawn reaches the back rank, you can get any piece that you want. So normally it's a queen, but you could get a rook, a knight, or a bishop. And the pawn just transforms into that piece. And you can have multiple pieces of the same thing. You can have 2, 3, 4, 5 queens if you got all your pawns back there and turned them into queens. So that's a cool thing about pawns. It's hard to do because they only move one space at a time, but it does happen, and that's something that you definitely need to understand. So that's pawn promotion. So the second special move in chess is called castling. Castling happens between the king and one of the rooks. You can do it both directions. You can castle king side, or you can castle queen side. And the way castling works is as long as you have not moved your king or your rook that you're trying to castle with, you move your king 2 spaces over, and the rook jumps around. So castling is the only move when the king is allowed to move 2 spaces at one time. And let me just back it up. You can also do it on the other side, 2 spaces over, and the rook hops to the other side of the king. One other thing to note about castling, you're not allowed to castle if you're in check. So if this knight was gone and black's bishop was over here, since I'm in check, I'm not allowed to castle. Also, you cannot castle if your king passes through check. So if, like I said, you move your king over 2 spaces, if you happen to land in a check when you tried to do that, you would not be allowed to do it. So I'm going to move this pawn off here, and I'm going to put this white bishop over here as an example. So if you notice, that bishop controls this square. So if I were to try to castle this way, my king is going to pass through that square. So I'm not allowed to do that. However, I could castle on this side, no problem, and the rook would jump around. Okay, so that's a special move number 2 in chess. All right, so the last special move in chess is called en passant, and it involves 2 pawns. So let me show you an example. I think en passant stands for like in passing in French or something. But anyway, if I move my pawn up, and let's say black moves his pawn up, and I move my pawn up again, normally this pawn could capture pieces that landed here and here, right? It captures forward diagonally 1 space. So those are the 2 spaces that the pawn could capture pieces. For example, if black moved this pawn up, I could capture it. That's just normally how the pawns work. I'm going to back up. En passant is a special case where if your opponent tries to move their pawn 2 spaces and lands directly on the side of your pawn, you can still capture it like you would normally capture that pawn, just like that, and this guy would go away. So let me back up one more time. Just to recap, even if they jump past you where it looks like, you shouldn't be able to capture it, so we'll do it on this side now. If it lands side by side your pawn, you can still capture it normally, just like that, and it goes away. Okay, so that's en passant. That's a special move with the pawn. Now, one thing that you have to be aware of, we'll go back to this side. If black plays this move, you have 1 chance to do that. You have to do it your very next move and take their pawn. If you don't, and you move something else, like your knight, you can no longer capture that pawn. So you only get 1 chance to do it. So that is something to be aware of. But that is en passant. That's the last of the 3 special moves in chess. So we've talked about pawn promotion. When a pawn makes it to the end of the board, you can get any piece you want. Castling with your king and your rook. And then en passant, special move between pawns. That's it for this video. I hope you learned something. If you could give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, I would really appreciate it. And let me know in the comments below if there's something that you want me to do another video on. And subscribe if you don't want to miss out on any more videos like this one. Thanks a lot.
If you want to get into of the game, Magnus Carlsen, Hikaru Nakamura facing off at the 2014 World Blitz Championship, and Magnus essaying the Scotch defense, the Scotch opening, which is not necessarily the most common at the highest level, eschewing the Rui Lopez and the Italian in favor of a slightly more rare line, and Hikaru responding with a bishop c5 variation, which is one of the most reputable, along with knight f6, and both sides developing their pieces. Magnus developing the bishop out to g5, pinning the knight on f6, and Hikaru looks up in a little bit of consternation, trying to remember his analysis as he fiddles with the pawn, and Hikaru taking the first significant think of the game as he tries to decide how to deal with that bishop on g5, and he decides not to deal with it for the time being as he continues to develop, and he castles kingside. And the big question for Magnus is, which way is he going to castle? He can move his queen up to d2, and he can castle queenside, or he can develop his light squared bishop and castle kingside. And he does develop his queen. He puts it on f3, pressuring Hikaru's knight on e5, and knight d4 is Nakamura's aggressive response, staking a claim in the center and offering a trade of knights. In the event of that trade, Hikaru lands a very powerful bishop on d4, which is going to be threatening in some cases to take the knight on c3. And if the queen recaptures on c3, there are tactics with knight f6 takes e4. Even though the queen on d8 is hanging, the queen on c3 potentially will also hang. So Magnus has that problem to deal with as now he falls behind by 30 seconds. Hikaru has played very confidently in the opening, and Magnus now taking a piece of his own to fidget with as he gives the position a sizable think, and there's the answer. He castles queenside, and once again, Hikaru looks off to the side. Maybe he's still in his analysis. Will he the knight on c3? That's the big question, and if he does, how is Magnus Carlsen going to recapture, with the queen or with the pawn? If he has to recapture with the pawn, then his entire queenside is going to be significantly damaged, and Hikaru will have attacking chances. And Hikaru very enticed by that possibility. Magnus not even thinking about taking back with a the queen because of knight takes e4, and he takes back with a pawn. And now the big threat is e4, e5, winning the knight on f6. Hikaru must deal with that immediately, and he does. He moves the rook out to e8, and Magnus completing his development by bringing his light squared bishop out to c4. Now notice that the pawn on e4 is untouchable. It cannot be captured with the rook because of queen takes e4, and the queen on d8 is going to be captured by white's bishop. So the pawn isn't the problem for white. The problem for white, as Magnus takes a sip of caffeinated Coca-Cola there, giving himself some energy to think about this complicated position. The problem for white is that damaged queenside. He cannot let black's queen get to a3 or the rook to get to the a file. All of that is a very dangerous possibility. But for the time being, white has some very active development, but a big move there by Magnus as he trades his dark squared bishop for the knight on f6, and he essentially forces an endgame where both sides now have very damaged pawn structures. Black has that damage on the king side, and white, respectively, has the damage structure on the queen side. But Hikaru taking active steps to fix his structure as he pushes the pawn up to f5, and he contests Magnus's control of the center. The idea is to undouble his pawns, and in the event of a trade on f5, black gets his light squared bishop out. And in that situation, I think black is the one who can argue that he's slightly better. So Magnus has to tread very carefully here as he falls now to a minute 20 on the clock. He's a full 40 seconds down. And we know how dangerous Hikaru is in his opponent's time pressure. And Magnus says, no, I'm not trading unless it's on my terms. And he drives the bishop up to d5. He is provoking the move c6, which looks very tempting, but then the bishop will drop back to b3, and Hikaru will have problems with his pawn on d6. So I don't think he's automatically going to play c6. Another sip from Magnus. He seems pretty happy with the way that the endgame is going, and a big decision here to be made by Hikaru. And he finally takes on e4. Magnus recaptures with his bishop, and rook e5 by Hikaru, preparing to lift the rook up to the queen side, but also putting the rook on a defended square. The threat was bishop takes h7 check with a discovered attack against that rook. But now that the rook is on a defended square, Hikaru doesn't have to worry about that anymore. And Magnus, for the second time, moves his bishop up to d5, knifing into black's position, a trade on e1, and king f8 by Hikaru to prevent white's rook from infiltrating to e7. The endgame looks pretty balanced to me, but there is still plenty of chess left to be played. This is not a dead draw. This is very far from a dead draw because there's a lot of pawn structure imbalance, with both sides having weaknesses on the respective flanks. c6, now played by Hikaru, driving the bishop away from the center. And will Hikaru play d5? Not just yet. He develops his bishop to f5 and moves it back to g6 in order to reinforce that we on f7. And Magnus says, I'm not letting you sleep peacefully on g6, h4, and Hikaru immediately responds with h5. The idea for Magnus was to play g4 and then h5 himself. That was not something Hikaru could have allowed. Magnus brings up his king into the center, and Hikaru pushes his rook down to d8, reinforcing the pawn on d6. Bishop c4 by Magnus. Is he preparing to offer a bishop trade? Yes, he is. And now Hikaru is the one who says, I'm fine to trade, but if you want to take on g6, you're going to have to help my pawn structure improve. Bishop takes g6, f takes g6, and black's kingside pawn structure is fully rectified. I don't think Magnus is going to trade. No, he does not. Instead, he pushes the a pawn up to a4, grabbing space on the queen side. And Hikaru does the same with b6. It does look like black has the more comfortable side of this endgame, but the likeliest outcome is definitely still a draw. Both of these players are legendary in the endgame. And Magnus drops the bishop back to e2, thinking better of that bishop trade and deciding to keep the bishops on the board as he pushes the pawn up to a5. What a bold move there. And if Hikaru takes on a5, the idea for white is rook to a4, when white not only recovers the pawn on a5, but then puts tremendous pressure on the a7 and c5 pawn. So I don't think Hikaru is going to capture that pawn on a5. In fact, I'm confident that he won't. So he keeps the tension, rook to f6, offering a trade of rooks, does Hikaru Nakamura. And in the event of that trade, I don't know who benefits for the time being. Magnus trades on b6, and he falls now to 30 seconds on the clock. He's got to make a decision fast, but he basically has to trade because if he moves the rook away from f4, he loses that critical pawn on f2. So he plays bishop f3, and he agrees to a trade of rooks, but once again, for the third time, he does it on his own terms, and he puts pressure on that d5 pawn. And if he can force Hikaru to push that pawn up to d4, and that d4 pawn is going to be a pretty massive liability for black. So a big decision here to be made for Hikaru. He can play rook d6 and keeps the rooks on the board, and he does just that. I think he's influenced by the fact that Magnus, now with 15 seconds on the clock and the more pieces on the board, the more complicated the position. Magnus making a waiting move, dropping the bishop back to g2 and keeping his eyes on the d5 pawn. And Hikaru does have a hard time bringing the king in toward the center. That rook on f4 is an absolute beast. It's keeping black's entire kingside at bay. And Hikaru hesitating a couple of times there. Rook to d8, bishop f3, the sides repeating moves. Magnus is obviously fine with a draw. Is Hikaru as well? No, Magnus is not fine with the draw. What a bold decision by the world champion. He brings the rook up to a4, but immediately puts it back on f4, thinking better of his bold decision because Hikaru, he's got all of his pawns well defended by that rook on d6, and now it's Nakamura's turn to play for a win as he pushes b5 and supports the pawn of the rook, and bishop drops back to g2. Magnus harassing black's queenside pawns with his bishop, and now the pawn on d5 is untouchable because of rook d6. What a vicious trap by Hikaru in his opponent's time pressure. Magnus now with 10 seconds on the clock, and hesitation there as he moves the bishop back to f1 for the umpteenth time. Rook a2 by Hikaru attacking c2, and now a bishop trade. And who benefits from this bishop trade? It's hard to tell. Now white is threatening rook f4 up to f5, forking the pawns on d5 and h5. Hikaru has to prevent that, and he does by moving his king up to g6. And now it's Magnus's turn to expand on the kingside g4, leading to some frustration by Nakamura. And the rook, is it going to move up to g5, checking the king and forcing it back to e6? And now Magnus, they passed pawn on h4. Is he going to push that passed pawn? Not just yet. He rook g1, preventing black's rook from traveling to the king side via a1. And now Hikaru, the one who looks a little bit frustrated. White wants to put that rook behind the pawn on h4, and the pawn is going to rumble up the board, up the runway. Rook a3 by Hikaru, pinning the pawn on c3, and Magnus brings the king back to d2. Hikaru desperately generating counterplay on the queen side, fiddling and twirling that pawn. Rook up to g3 by Magnus, offering a rook trade. Who benefits in the event of that rook trade? I think it was white. Now the rook gets behind the pawn, but Hikaru is in time to stop the pawn with his king. He is just in time, tempo for tempo, and now the pawn on h6 is immobilized. And I think the game is very likely to fizzle out into a draw. Rook to a6, winning the pawn on h6. Magnus wins the pawn on b4, and now the sides only have two pawns left, and they're about to have one pawn left. King to e2, rook e6, check, back and forth, go the rooks, rook takes d5, rook takes f2. This is a dead draw, even though black's king is further away from white's pawn than white's king from black's pawn, because black's rook is more than capable of holding that pawn back, and the sides repeating moves, looking at each other and shaking hands. What an amazing battle between